Britain was part of the continent of Eurasia until the end of the last ice age, 6000 BC. It became an island when the lower land under the present-day English Channel was flooded. The early inhabitants of Britain were small groups of hunters, gatherers, and fishermen. About 3000 to 2000 BC, tribes of dark-haired people called Iverins began to arrive. After 700 BC, new invaders appeared in Britain. They were called Celts. The Celtic conquerors were technically more advanced than the Iverins. They were rural farming, hunting, and herding tribes ruled by local chieftains. 2 centuries later, a second wave of Celts arrived. They didn't appear until the Iron Age. The centers of Celtic civilization lay in the south and southeast of the island. In 43 AD, the Emperor Claudius made a successful conquest of Britain as far as the river Severn and Trent. The Romans began to organize Britain as a province, which they called Britannia. A number of towns grew up during the Roman occupation. Roman rule was resisted by some Celtic leaders. The Romans introduced their customs, language, agriculture, and eventually in the 4th century Christianity. However, when the Romans withdrew after 410 AD, few permanent effects of their rule remained. The next invasion of Britain was made by the Germanic tribes of Saxon Anjous and Jutes, who came from what are now North Germany and Denmark. By 600, the southeastern part of Britain was completely occupied by the invaders and was named Angleland. Within the next 100 years, all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were converted to the Christian faith. At the turn of the 8th century, another wave of Scandinavian invaders arrived in Britain. First, these Vikings or Northmen invaded the Shetland and Faroe Islands. Later, they reached the coast of England, Scotland, and Ireland. They plundered and burned churches and monasteries. In the 9th century, they began to colonize East Anglia, Northumbria, and the northeast of Mercia. Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, was the only Anglo-Saxon leader who successfully resisted this expansion. The new King of England, Edward the Confessor, was Anglo-Saxon. He ruled Wesley until his death in 1066. Since that time, England has not been invaded.
After defeating the Anglo-Saxon King Harold and the battle in 1066, William of Normandy introduced the normal feudal system, and the French-speaking was the main language for upper classes. Until 14th century, an important fact in England was the design of the Magna Carta. That document contained a long list of limitations to the king's power, and these rights obtained by the barons were eventually extended to the entire population. And the King John being forced to sign the Magna Carta and remained in 1215. Another important fact on that time was the origins of Parliament. are to be found in the reign of John's successor, Henry III. It was a meeting of the king and his barons and servants at which various administrative and financial problems were discussed. In order to make it easier to put the decision taken in practice, each shire had to elect a number of knights to attend these meetings and report the decision to their shires. Edward continued with this experiment in 1295, called a parliament that became known as the Model of Parliament.
Open quotes. The Hundred Years' War was a series of conflicts in 1337 to 1453 between the Kingdom of England and France for control French throne. William the Conqueror, who became King of England in 1066, will retain in possession of the Duchy of Normandy in France. As the rulers of Normandy, the English kings over feudal homage to the King of France. In 1337, Edward III of England refused to pay homage to Philip VI of France, leading the French king to claim confiscation of Edward's lands in Aquitania. Edward responded that he was the King of France, a claim dating to 1328, when Edward's uncle Charles IV of France died without a direct male line. Edward was the closest male relative of the dead king. The legal succession to the French crown was the central to the war over generations of English and French claimants. The Black Death was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, killing an estimated 70 million of people and keeping in Europe in the years 1348-1350. It is thought to have started in China, and then have traveled along the Silk Road and reached the Crimea by 1346. From there it was most likely carried by Oriental rats fleets, living on the black rats that were regular patients of merchant ships. The Peasant Revolt was a revolt that improved the conditions of the peasant class and was the first step toward the ending of the feudal system in England. Close quotes.
War of the Roses and Tudors. January the 26th, 1340, Edward III assumed the title of King of France. Although the Anglo-French conflict had been an intermittent feature since 1066, a challenge to the French power had been made by any previous monarch. Before the war ended in 1453, with the expulsion of the English from all their French possessions, they created an heroic tradition of military success, and like many other wars, the 100 Years' War had its origins in a peace settlement. The War of the Roses were a series of dynastic wars fought between supporters of two rival branches of the royal house of Plantagenet, the houses of Lancaster and York, for the throne of England. The final victory went to the Lancastrian claimant Henry Tudor, who defeated the last Yorkist king Richard III and married Edward IV's daughter Elizabeth of York to unite the two houses. The House of Tudor subsequently ruled England and Wales until 1603. York's eldest son, Edward, was proclaimed King Edward IV. He gathered the Yorkist armies and won a crushing victory on the Battle of Towton in March 1461. After Lancastrian revolts in the north were suppressed in 1464, and Henry was captured once again, Edward fell out with his chief supporter, the Earl of Warwick, and also alienated many friends and even family members by favoring the family of his queen Elizabeth Woodville, whom he had married in secret. Warwick tried first to supplant Edward with his younger brother George, and then to restore Henry VI to the throne. The result in 2 years of rapid changes of fortune before Edward IV once again won complete victories, where Warwick was killed, where the Lancastrian Edward Prince of Wales was executed after the battle. Henry was murdered in the Tower of London several days later, ending the direct Lancastrian line of succession. A period of comparative peace followed, but King Edward died unexpectedly in 1483. His surviving brother, Richard of Gloucester, first moved to prevent the unpopular Woodville family of Edward's widow from participating in the government during the minority of Edward's son, Edward V, and then seized the throne for himself, using the suspect legitimacy of Edward IV's marriage as pretext. Henry Tudor, a distant relative of Lancastrian kings, who had inherited their claim, defeated Richard at Bosworth in 1485. He was crowned Henry VII and married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, to unite and reconcile the two houses. The Tudor dynasty, or House of Tudor, was a descendant of the princes that ruled the Kingdom of England as its realms, including the Lordship of Ireland from 1485 to 1603. The first monarch was Henry VII, and the Tudor family woke in the War of the Roses, which left the House of Lancaster, to which the Tudors were aligned, extinct. In total, 5 Tudor monarchs ruled the domains for over a century. Henry VIII of England was the only male to live to the age of maturity. Henry VII left one of the many concerns of the kings, and is that during the reign he worried about reaccumulating the funds in the royal treasury. England had never been one of the most richest countries, and after the War of Roses they were broke. Through his strategy of being very, very strict, he was able to leave an amount of money to his successor Henry VIII. Although it was debated if Henry VII was a great king, he was a successful one because he restored the nation's finances, he strengthened the judicial system, and he denied all of other claimants to the throne, so he could secure his descendants. Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon on June 11th of 1509. Catherine was Henry's older brother's wife, making the path for their marriage a rocky one from the start. Despite the fact that Henry's father died before he was married to Catherine, he was determined to marry her anyway and make sure that everyone he knew intended his own master. When Henry first came to the throne, he had very little interest in archery and on ruling. He preferred to live on luxury and play sports. He let others control the kingdom on the first 2 years, and then his younger years was described as a gentle friendliness, gentle in debate, and acted more as a companion than a thing. He was generous, and his gifts and affection were said to be easy to get along with. However, the Henry that many people picture was that he was obese, volatile, and he was known for his great cruelty. Unfortunately, Catherine did not bear Henry. Catherine's first child, a daughter, was stillborn, and her second child, a son named Henry, died being a baby. When it became clear to Henry that the Tudor dynasty was in risk, he contacted the Cardinal Thomas Wolsey about the possibility of annulling the marriage to Catherine. However, it was very clear that he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, which is a woman from Catherine's court that he fell in love with. Anne, after becoming pregnant by the end of 1532, gave birth on September the 7th of 1533 to Elizabeth, named in honor of Henry's mother. Anne had later pregnancies with miscarriage or stillbirth. However, in 1536, Anne was arrested along with 6 courtiers. Thomas Cromwell stepped in again, claiming that Anne had taken lovers during her marriage, and she was tried for treason, witchcraft, and incest, and these charges were most likely fabricated, but she was found guilty and killed on June 1536. Henry got married again to Jane Seymour. Jane became pregnant on 1537, who was King Edward VI following Henry's death on 1547. Jane died of fever only a few days later after the birth, and then, on 1540, Henry married to Anne of Cleves. Whatever happened on the circumstances, the marriage was not successful, and Anne agreed to a peaceful annulment, assuming that she didn't like the title and she would like to have a divorce immediately. The fifth marriage was to the Catholic Catherine Howard. Henry's had a fancy with Catherine before he was divorced from Anne, and she was part of Anne's court. Catherine was forced into a marriage of this obese man of over 30 years for her, and she had never desired to marry Henry. And instead she had an affair with Thomas Culpeper, which is the king's favorite in that time. And during her questioning, Catherine denied everything, but then she confessed the infidelity, and then Henry tried to torture her to death, but then she was accused for treason and she was executed on 1542. Then, after Henry was killed, the successor was Mary I. Mary I wanted to restore the Catholic faith, and she had frustration as she was married, but it seems like her husband never got her pregnant, so she started becoming bitter, and then she burned a lot of Protestants between 1555 and 1558. Mary died in 1558 at 42 years old. She was known for being Bloody Mary, as she killed so many people without a valid reason. Then Elizabeth Tudor, her little sister, which she never recognized, took the throne, being 25 years old, and she became Elizabeth I of England. Elizabeth had a long path to the throne. She had a lot of problems because she, of course, had a rough childhood because of the execution of her mother, Anne Boleyn. When Anne was killed, Henry declared Elizabeth as an illegitimate child, and she wouldn't be able to get to the throne. However, she was raised by a widow, Catherine Parr, and her husband, Thomas Seymour, the first Baron Seymour of Sutherland. Then a scandal went out with these two people, and she answered truthfully, and she had the charges dropped. Even though Elizabeth was only 25 when she got to the throne, she was an excellent student. She knew Latin, French, Italian, and some part of Greek. She was a talented writer, and she was a talented musician and singing and playing the lute. She was very sure that she didn't want to get married. However, there are certain theories about this, and she knew that if she gave the throne, then another person that it was not from the Tudors could possibly inherit the fortune, and she didn't want that because she did so many changes for the population. During this period, the discovery of America gave to Britain a center of the world's trading routes, and they developed a great navigation development.